If your IGCSE Edexcel English Language Paper 2 is coming up this Friday and you're feeling overwhelmed or panicked or unprepared, then don't worry, you're exactly the kind of person I've made this video for. In the next 20 minutes or so, I'll walk you through the paper. I'll give you some pointers as to the kinds of mistakes that cost students marks. And I'll give you some examples from my experience as an examiner as to what the marker will be looking for when you attempt this paper. Okay, so paper 2, I've just selected a random paper from 2024, but I'll walk you through what I would expect you to be considering as you attempt this paper. So the first thing to note is that this paper is 1 hour and 30 minutes. Not a long time, quite a lot to do within that time. So make sure that you are keeping an eye on the clock and that you are thinking about the various sections that you need to complete. Total mark is 60 for this paper. And let's have a look at section A. So this is the reading section, and as it suggests, this is taken from the Pearson Edexcel English Anthology. So really the only way to prepare for this section of the exam is to make sure that you have revised all of the paper 2 texts in the paper 2 section. So this would be the poems Disabled, Out, Unknown Girl, Bright Lights of Sarajevo, Still I Rise, and then you have the prose pieces, the short stories, The Story of an Hour, The Necklace, Significant Cigarettes, Whistle and I'll Come to You, and Night. So there is no shortcut to learning those pieces. You need to have gone through them in class. Hopefully your class teacher will have given you lots of revision notes, PowerPoint slides, and you are given a clean copy of whichever text they're going to choose from that section. The intention is that you shouldn't really need a huge amount of time to read it. It should just be there for reference. So if in the exam is the first time you're reading one of these texts, then that would be quite problematic. You should spend about 45 minutes on the section as it suggests. And remember, one of the mistakes that students make on this is they will immediately go to whichever of the texts that is referenced, and they will start to write everything they possibly know about the text in their answer, forgetting that in actual fact there is a question to answer here. Now on this particular occasion, the question centered around an unknown girl. And the question was, how does the writer present the importance of traditional Indian culture in an unknown girl? So you need to make sure that this is going to be at the center of whatever it is you write about in your answer. Not, can I remember every possible nuance with language? Do I remember what all the linguistic features were? Can I talk about the structure? Yes, of course, you can end up talking about those things and that will get you marks. But you need to make sure that everything you mention in terms of language or structure brings your answer back to answering that original question. The other thing students forget is that anything in bullet points is there as almost a checklist for you to make sure that you are talking about. Exam boards do not publish information like this with the intention that you ignore it. So in this case, it says in your answer you should write about how the writer presents cultural experience, how the writer presents feelings about the place, and the use of language and structure. So if this was me, I would make sure that that is a checklist and that every paragraph that I write features references to one of those things. This line is always a fixture. You should support your answer with close reference to the poem, including brief quotations. I have seen students attempt answers on section A without using a single quotation from whatever extract it is they're giving you. that really is inexcusable. Unlike some of the other parts of the exams where maybe, for example, with of mice and men, you need to revise the quotations. Here, you don't need to bank or memorize quotations because you've got a blank copy of the text in front of you. So when it says you should be referencing the poem, or if it's a prose piece, you do really need to make sure that you are anchoring every paragraph with a quotation taken from that piece. 30 marks. How do you get those 30 marks? I'm not going to centre on an unknown girl because this may not be the text that you are given. So if we just look at the mark scheme for a moment, in terms of what the examiner is going to be looking for, there are two separate assessment objectives for this question. You need to remember that for assessment objective 1, which is out of 12 marks, this is where they're looking for your understanding of whichever piece they're giving you in the exam. So if you look at the language of the mark scheme, for a level 1, you're only showing basic understanding of the text. Your selection of ideas or information or perspectives is limited, and you're very rarely using any references. So if you are wanting as high a grade as possible, a grade 8 or a grade 9 will need to be in level 4, a detailed, sustained understanding of the text. The examiner reading your response has to have little question in their mind that you know that text implicitly well. Look at the mark scheme, sustained understanding. The selection and interpretation of ideas, information, perspectives is detailed, fully supports the points being made. And the selection of references is detailed, appropriate, again, fully supports the points being made. So in this case, if you were writing about how Manaiza Alvi presents the importance of traditional Indian culture, you need to make sure that everything you say is sustained, is detailed, and fully supports the points you're making in response to that question. And that's the assessment objective 1, that would be getting you up to 12 marks out of the 30. The lion's share of the marks in this case would be AO2. Now this is out of 18 marks, and this is where you are demonstrating an understanding of how writers use linguistic or structural devices to achieve their effects. So assessment objective 1 is checking you understand what the text is about. Assessment objective number 2 is kind of explaining the magic trick. You are talking about where the writer is using similes or metaphors or euphemism, or they're being deliberately ambiguous, or they're using imagery, or they've used personification or juxtaposition. All of those language devices, all of those literary terms need to be finding their way into your judgment for AO2. And of course, structure. Another mistake that students make is they forget to talk about structure. So not only are you talking about linguistic devices, but you're asking you're explaining to the examiner, you understand how the writer has used structure, how they have built the piece deliberately to manipulate our thoughts and feelings. Now, in the case of a poem, that might be examining stanza structure. In this case, we're obviously looking at one long stanza. You are considering, is there a rhyme scheme in here? In this case, why is the poem shaped like it is on the page? So things in terms of structure would be how the piece begins, how it develops, how it ends, if it's a prose piece. You would be looking at turning points within the story. If it's a poem, is there a volta? Is there a key turning point, a learning lesson? If it's a poem, is there a rhyme scheme? Does it have a pattern? Does it have an expected rhythm? If not, is it free verse? Is it blank verse? And if so, why might that be? So for assessment objective 2, if we look at the language of the mark scheme there, for level 1, it's limited. You have limited selection of textual references. It's basic, simple comment on the effect of language and or structure. It may be that for this low level, the student barely mentions structure at all. I often say to my students, deal with structure first, because examiners often think that students are wary about dealing with structure and they put it off to the very end, and there might be a nominal short paragraph at the end just dealing with some very basic comment on structure. If you go straight in with a comment about structure, something you have noticed, a nuance that the writer is doing with structure, then that won't do you any harm at all. Obviously, you should be striving for the highest possible marks, so look at the language here for level 5. Discriminating, perceptive, analytical. To get up to 18 marks out of the 30, you're looking at the subtleties. You're not just saying the obvious things that appear to you about, in this case, how Alvi presents the importance of traditional Indian culture. You're making very nuanced, very clever, very perceptive comments on any language or structural features that you notice. I would say in this particular poem, it's heavily imagery based. And obviously with the poem being set in the early 90s, there are some very specific references to that influence our thoughts and feelings. It's almost taking us back, giving us a snapshot of time. But, phrases like cohesion, the cohesive device, words like bazaar and rupees and the hennaing, even peacocking. There's got all of these little references threading its way through the piece, cohesively tying the piece together. The more of those kinds of linguistic features you discuss, the more discriminating you are with the references that you use. Don't just throw everything into an answer. Discriminating means you're being very specific with the particular references that you're making. Now, obviously, with 30 marks, you're probably going to have maximum 45 minutes on this. Now, I would say 10 to 15 minutes would be your planning time in thinking about how you're going to answer the question and deal with these things. So you're really going to have about 30 to 35 minutes to write the thing. Well, within about half an hour, realistically, you're not going to be writing more than 3 or 4 developed paragraphs. And again, hopefully by now you understand the petal structure. What is the point that you're making in answering this particular question? What is the evidence, a quotation that you wish to back up that piece of point that you want to make? The technique is then obviously the literary or structural technique that you wish to be talking about, all the while analysing and then linking back to the original question. That's quite a lot to do in one paragraph. And so within 30 minutes, I would say most students will probably manage to do that times 4. Maybe 5, depending on how fast you get your ideas together and how fast you can write. But any less than 4 developed petal paragraphs, and you're probably not doing that in enough detail. So that would be my advice in terms of approach to section A. And obviously, before you put any pen to paper, make sure that you have familiarized or refamiliarized yourself with whichever of those texts you're going to get. I might link another video to the text that I've come up with in the past few years, so you can maybe think about what might come up on this particular season. But do not begin to answer the question until you've refamiliarized yourself with the text, you've focused your thinking on what the question is asking for, and then every paragraph that you write, the link, pause before you continue writing the next paragraph, go back to the original question, ask yourself, am I answering this question? If you are, brilliant, good, carry on. If you feel like you're wandering away from the topic of the question, get back on track as you enter into the next petal paragraph. Okay, section B. So hopefully you know that you will get a choice in this. It's an obvious thing to say, but you get a choice of either question 2 or question 3 or question 4. The reason I point that out is because, again, as an examiner, I have seen students answer more than one. I've even seen students answer all 3. I'm not entirely sure why they did that. Maybe they were trying to impress, but all you're doing by answering more than one is illustrating that you haven't answered the question. Again, it's equally weighted, so section A is worth 30 marks and you should spend 45 minutes. Section B is the same, 45 minutes for 30 marks. Now again, it could be the case that your poetry and prose response is your weaker area or the one you find difficult, in which case make sure you're giving yourself a good 45 minutes on the imaginative writing. It could be, of course, vice versa. Some students are more confident with the reading section than they are with the writing, but each to their own. Obviously, just make sure you're giving yourself the maximum amount of time possible to do well on any section. Now, no, don't forget that this is imaginative writing. So unlike paper 1, which was transactional, which was non-fiction, which was, a real world application, here is your ability to shine with your own imagination, your own creativity, your own originality, and try to be as imaginative as possible in your response. So in this particular series, you had the option of writing about a time when you or someone you know decorated something. Your response could be real or imagined. You'll notice that line is a fixture in every option. The examiner doesn't really care whether what you write about is real and actually happened, or whether you're writing about an imagined set of circumstances. No one is going to come checking. What I would suggest is that if you are pertaining to it being a realistic scenario, then don't be too outlandish with the details. If you're struggling to think of a real occasion that something happened, then obviously you're going to have to fabricate the details. Very often students do a bit of both. They will come up with, hang their answer on something that realistically did happen to them, but they will throw in some imagined details just to make the writing more interesting, and that's perfectly fine as well. The other fixture is, of course, your response will be marked for the accurate and appropriate use of vocabulary, spelling, punctuation, and grammar. That's the technical aspect of this task. I'll come to that in the mark scheme in a moment. So if you don't fancy the first option, the second option would be write a story with the title A Perfect Place. So very often the first option might be write about a time ... Second option might be write a story with the title and they give you the title. And the third option will be look at the images provided, and they'll give you a couple of black and white images to hang a response on. What I would say is be careful that you don't hybridize a response. What I mean by that is sometimes people like the look of the images on question 4. So write a story that begins with our eyes suddenly met, and they're starting to look at these images, but then they write a story with the title A Perfect Place, and they still use those images. So what you need to be careful of is that you don't mishmash a response together when the examiner is then struggling to understand, well, did they do number 3? Did they do number 4? I think when you begin to answer the question, you need to indicate clearly whether it was 2, 3, or 4. So I would say whichever of these 3 you choose, make it very clear, very separate which of the tasks you've attempted. The question usually arises, well, which is the easiest? Is it the fact that the picture's there? Does that make life easier for me? I don't think so. Remember, there is no question that is easier than any of the others. It's very much a case of what fits you best on the day. Some students will naturally gravitate to the picture task because for some reason the visuals there will help them prompt a story, but sometimes the visuals can be quite restrictive as well. So I would say you can't really make the decision until the day of the exam. Very carefully use your planning time to think about which of these is best for you, and I often recommend you plan for more than one. If you gravitate to one naturally, don't be too hasty to choose that one. That's the one I should definitely do, without thinking through perhaps maybe there's a second option I need to do a quick plan for as well. Because sometimes the one that you instinctively go for, when you think it through, you maybe don't have as many ideas as the second one you may plan for, that then you do discover, actually, I've got more to say on that. So whether you are a mind mapper, a bullet point lister, however you plan, just make sure that you've consolidated, you've thought through your ideas before you begin. Because if you don't, there's a very good chance you might write a fantastic opener, you might write a good couple of lines to get going, but then you run out of ideas quite fast and you spend you waste the next 5-10 minutes daydreaming, procrastinating before you can get back on track. And that's time that you could write a paragraph that's going to get you extra marks. Added to my earlier point, it does suggest you may choose one image to prompt your response to question 4. So as I suggested in terms of not hybridizing the questions, make sure you don't hybridize the photos. You choose this one or this one to stimulate the piece you want to write about. So in terms of the mark scheme, what's the exam board looking for on this one? As with section A, there are 2 assessment objectives. So it's not the case that they just give you a mark out of 30. There is a mark for assessment objective 4 out of 18, and then there is a mark out of 12 for assessment objective 5. So assessment objective 4 is concerning how well you have communicated an imaginative story. How believable, how convincing is your piece as an interestingly crafted piece of entertaining writing? How well have you been able to adapt your form, tone, and register for whatever the purpose is and whoever the audience for your piece might be? So I would say, as a piece of advice, to have your audience in mind when you are writing. Try to think about who would be reading this, not just an examiner, but who would be reading this for entertainment and what would they get from it? I'm not going to go through the lower levels because, again, we want to be striving for the very best. But to get a level 5, so this is into grade 8 and grade 9 territory, your communication will be perceptive and subtle. Your task is sharply focused on the expectations and the requirements of the intended reader, and the way in which you use your language is sophisticated in terms of tone and register. So I often say that section A gets you to analyze someone else's writing for the linguistic devices, the linguistic techniques. Section B is you deploying them yourself. So whilst in section A you might be discussing whichever of the writers from the part 2 anthology you've studied, how they use similes or metaphors or personification or euphemisms or imagery. But section B is your opportunity to deploy those strategies to make your writing as interesting as it could possibly be. If you're noticing a writer is using lots of sensory imagery, sensory description, figurative language in section A, then in section B, you show the examiner that you can use those strategies in your own writing for interesting techniques, interesting effect. Okay, so that would be AO4 for up to 18 out of those 30 marks. For AO5, this is your SPAG, spelling, punctuation and grammar. So remember, I often say to my students, you are being assessed not just as a Key Stage 4, end of year 11, 16-year-old student. This is where the examiner is considering what you have learnt in English in all of your school career. How ambitious is the vocabulary that you can use? How is your spelling? Are you able to paragraph? Are you able to use punctuation effectively? If you've got characters speaking in your piece, are you able to use speech marks effectively? Do you know where to place question marks, exclamatories? Are we being careful we're not overusing certain punctuation and sliding into text messaging, WhatsApp kind of territory? So your AO5 mark for up to 12 out of the 30 marks is very much looking at how you can use grammatical features, vocabulary. So this is your opportunity to try and up-level your language wherever you can. If there are any possibilities, any opportunities for you to use better language, more interesting words, more ambitious vocabulary, then do so. They don't penalise you for spelling or spelling errors if you are trying for more complex words. It says there in the level 5, rare spelling errors do not detract from overall meaning. So don't be dissuaded from trying to use more ambitious vocabulary and then making a slight misspell. Where it's less forgivable is if you're making spelling errors of very basic words, words that, you should be able to spell in year 7 or in junior school. So for this, up to 12 marks, structural, how you're able to use sentence length for deliberate effect, how you're able to manipulate the length of your paragraphs for deliberate intent, how well you're able to use your vocabulary, and how well you're able to use your punctuation. And the better you can do that, the higher your mark for AO5 is going to be. I hope that's been of some use. Remember, examiners are not looking for perfection. What they are looking for is for you to showcase everything you've learned over the past couple of years and for you to answer the question. So really do take time to read the questions carefully, plan your responses before you start, and then show them what you can do. It will all be fine. If you found any value in this video, if you've liked the style of this video, please give us a thumbs up and maybe consider subscribing for similar content in the future. If you've got any questions, do please ask them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer. Good luck, everybody.